Hi everyone. Today we're going to work on Unit 2, Day 1 for 11th grade, where there's a focus on the causation tool. This is part 1, where we're going to actually look at the tool, take apart some steps, speak about how to work with it. And in part 2, we're going to actually take a deeper dive, as the tool actually tells us to do, where we're going to work with it with another source, or an actual source, depending on who you ask, and we're going to look for some other things as well. So the causation tool, here it is in all its glory. It says Causation Tool. And you look at it, it gives you directions, and then it gives you an organizer. So let's look at the beginning before we go further. It says Causation Tool. Picture history as an iceberg. Even has an iceberg in the background if you take a look. Often, we focus on the obvious changes in events, the moments in history that seem important, significant, and are clearly connected to a larger unit of study. But these are just the tip of the iceberg at the very edge. Remember, only the top of the iceberg sticks out in the water. Focus on only the tip of the iceberg, we are at risk of seeing history as simplistic, disconnected, and inevitable, meaning bound to happen. Rather, we should take a deep dive to explore the whole of the iceberg. This means examining the immediate and long-term causes, the relationship of a historical moment to connected events, and a consideration of larger societal forces, meaning what was going on, the bigger picture, and the deep historical contingency is meaning the concept that historical events are dependent on each other and always have multiple causes. So we got 4 things to do that they say: tip of the iceberg, just above the surface, just below the surface, and deep dive. So how are we going to take that apart? Okay, your teacher may have asked you to think about life experience or something past in social studies, to think about the reasons for certain things, the reasons for conflict. Like, for example, the immediate trigger, it says, for World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Like that would be a trigger. The immediate trigger would be the assassination. We're talking for World War I of the Archduke. Short-term causes would be the alliances between the Allied and Central Powers, although they didn't have those names at the beginning of World War I, although you'll probably only remember them by those words. And long-term causes, your teacher may have given you mania, although one of them is alliances, which is, in global, you probably remember militarism. A is the alliances. Ignore that because I put them more at short-term. Nationalism, imperialism. And I'm going to leave the A out because that's the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So that's how, let's say you did it last year for global and World War I, right? Now, when you think about it, you have your triggers, right? Or what caused it, thinking about World War I. Your trigger is what actually caused it, what actually made it happen. And I'm going to highlight that in bright blue. Anytime you see a trigger, you're going to highlight it in bright blue. Click to add text because your teacher may give you this organizer to think about life or think about something else. Next, short term, I'm going to highlight it yellow because that's more like thinking about the bigger picture, what really pushed things to happen. And long term, I'm going to highlight that bright pink. Meaning what caused the preconditions or the short-term things to occur. And I got my colors from an introduction or model your teacher may share with you called Alphonse the Camel by Arthur Chapman. They made the triggers that I showed you before blue, short-term yellow, long-term pink. What we're going to eventually get to, was the Civil War inevitable, right? And you're going to have to look at the trigger, which is, I'll tell you now, the attack on Fort Sumter, but you're not there yet. Long-term causes, short-term causes that were most impactful. And you could break these causes into economic, social, political, cultural, but we're not there yet. Your teacher may also share with you how to highlight in Google Slides, which you probably already know. If you don't, you go up top, you click on the text, and they're showing you here, you highlight, right? You could check the color you want. Remember, for trigger, it's blue. For short-term, it's yellow. For long-term, it's pink. Don't do what I did before. That will change your text color. Don't do that. Unless you have a reason to want to change text color, your teacher's not going to ask you to do that. Now, you're going to look for the triggers, again, over here. Short-term cause, long-term cause, for Alphonse the Camel. by Arthur Chapman. Now, Arthur Chapman is a professor in history education at the UCL Institute of Education. That's University College London. He was a history teacher for 12 years before taking the university post in history education. He's an editor for the International Review of History Education, which I've actually seen. It's pretty cool. The short story that follows a historical allegory, meaning it didn't actually happen. And the point of the story is intended to help students develop interpretation of the past by applying causal reasoning, meaning that whole trigger, short-term, long-term situation, right? And again, you're looking for your trigger, short-term, long-term. Okay, now what happened? Once upon a time, there was a camel called Alphonse. For various reasons relating to an unfortunate accident during his birth, the camel had severe back problems. This was not the end of his misfortune, however, because he had an evil, exploitative, that means take advantage, owner called Frank the Camel Killer, who regularly overloaded his camels prior to taking them on grueling and totally unnecessary round trips up and down mountains on his way to deliver goods to his customers. These customers, shockingly, were completely indifferent, meaning they couldn't have cared less, to these frequent and gross violations of the rights of camels, and found Frank and his antics at least vaguely endearing, meaning they actually thought it was cute that he was overloading his poor camel, who was born with a bad back. Well, one day, Frank had just finished loading up Alphonse and his poor, exploited fellow creatures for yet another grueling, really hard, and totally unnecessary round trip up and down the mountains. He had piled and piled and piled up the goods onto Alphonse's back and was taking a break and reflected smugly, he was very proud of himself, on his handiwork chewing a straw. On a whim, he felt like it, he decided to add the bedraggled straw, that like beaten up straw he'd been chewing, to Alphonse's load. Alphonse growled obligingly. He's like, okay, throw it on. He eyed his owner with disgust. He keeled over and died of radical and irreversible back collapse. Ouch. Poor Alphonse the camel. But let's go back here. What was the trigger or spark? What actually caused poor Alphonse the camel to die? Let's go back here and look. I'll give you a minute. And you're like, that's obvious. It's the straw, the immediate trigger. He added the straw to Alphonse's back. That's the trigger. I'm going to highlight it light blue. That's the straw that broke the camel's back. Now let's go back here in reference. I need the short-term causes. What made it happen like right before? Well, it says he piled and piled and piled up the goods on Alphonse's back. Okay, he just put on way too much as usual. The fact that he looked at Alphonse smugly, that may have insulted him. I don't know if I would put that as a short-term cause, but short-term, he's yellow. He piled and piled it on too. Now, long-term, take a minute to think. Let's go back to the beginning. Long-term, the camel had severe back problems, right? And he had an evil, exploitative owner. His owner took advantage of him. Regularly overloaded his camels. Notice there are a lot of long-term causes, and one kind of leads to the other, okay? And to deliver goods, and his customers were completely indifferent. They didn't care that the camels were being abused. So you can go back, you hot pink text, yellow text, and blue text, back into your organizer. You have the triggers, short-term cause, long-term cause. So if someone were to give you a complex text, you would do the same thing. But the trigger, let's just start to get our head around this, is the spark, what actually caused it. You're going to have to say what was going on in history. Okay, that's about poor Alphonse the camel getting hurt. You're going to have to say when it happened, which we don't know. The place is on the side of the mountain. Involve people or groups, the people who didn't care, and Alphonse's nasty owner and Alphonse. What changed? Alphonse died of the straw that broke the camel's back. That's the trigger, right? That's, by the way, also, notice the first step in the causation tool. Next, just above the surface, short-term cause, he put too much onto the camel. Other immediate forces, he had been doing it for a while. Just below the surface. How does the timing of the event connect to other historical changes? Well, he'd been doing it for a long time. What forces a trend active below the surface to cause the moment? Well, we'll say socially, the people didn't care that they were overloading him, economically, that he was taking advantage and putting too much onto the camel. And politically, well, I don't know. I guess Frank was a powerful guy and they were scared of him. Now, I don't know how we would do the deeper dive um, in regard to Alphonse the camel, or similar or different back then compared to the present, unless you want to say people take advantage of other people today. Where did the moment happen? Um, you can make your own category, you can, if you'd like, but how did it impact the moment? You could say that there were militaristic, intellectual, or religious ideas. I would say that there was a power idea where they were people taking advantage of the camels, people specifically, Alphonse's nasty owner. So they give you this Alphonse text as an example. Your teacher may actually share it with you, but your point is that you're trying to think about the tip of the iceberg, what's just above the surface, what's just below the surface. It's a little harder to do the deeper dive with Alphonse the camel and his poor straw that broke his back. But we're going to do that with a different source in the next clip, so stay tuned.